April 1945. British-occupied Germany. The cattle truck doors swing open, blinding sunlight flooding 40 captured German women who'd been taught exactly what comes next. That Allied soldiers were animals, that Russian troops had done unspeakable things in the East, that the British would be no different. Greta Meyer, a former Luftwaffe signals operator, clutches a torn photograph of her sister, her hands trembling as guards begin shouting orders. But then something impossible happens. A British guard catches a stumbling woman and immediately steps back, hands raised. "Watch your step, ma'am," he says. Ma'am? These women had spent years hearing one truth, believing it with every fiber, only to face guards who don't leer, don't shove, don't even touch them. The propaganda had promised monsters. Instead, they found men following rules, and that contradiction would prove far more devastating than any brutality. Before we begin, if you want more incredible untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. April 1945. The cattle truck lurched to a final shuddering stop, and Greta Meyer felt her stomach drop. For 3 days, they'd been packed inside. 40 women, maybe more, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the darkness that smelled of sweat and fear and the sharp tang of urine from the corner where someone had finally given up on dignity. No one spoke much anymore. What was there to say? They all knew what was coming. Greta's fingers traced the torn edge of the photograph she'd been clutching since capture. Her sister Annalise, age 14 in the picture, smiling in her Sunday dress before the world caught fire. The paper had gone soft from handling, the crease down the middle threatening to split Annalise's face in two. Greta pressed it flat against her palm as if she could protect it, protect her, protect anything at all from what waited outside those doors. The British voices came first, clipped, calm, impossibly controlled. Form 2 lines. No talking. Keep your hands visible. Then the screech of metal, the flood of light so bright it felt like a physical blow, and Greta raised her arm to shield her eyes, squinting through her fingers at the silhouettes of soldiers backlit by an afternoon sun that seemed obscenely cheerful. She'd been taught what came next. Everyone had. The propaganda had been relentless, printed in Der Stürmer, whispered in bunkers, repeated by officers until it became scripture. The Allies were animals. The Russians in the East had done things too horrible to speak aloud. Women violated, children murdered, entire villages erased in orgies of revenge. And the British, for all their supposed civility, would be no different. Men were men, victors were victors, and defeated German women were nothing but spoils of war. Greta's heart hammered against her ribs as the guards began calling them out one by one. She watched the woman in front of her, Hilda Fogel, a factory supervisor from Hamburg with 2 children she hadn't seen in 8 months, stumble on the truck's metal step. Greta tensed, waiting for the shove, the curse, the casual brutality of a guard who'd learned to enjoy his power. Instead, the British soldier caught Hilda's elbow, steadied her, then immediately stepped back, both hands raised as if she'd frightened him. "Watch your step, ma'am," he said in accented but clear German. "Ma'am?" The word hung in the air like something from another universe. Hilda's face went blank with confusion. She stood frozen on the ground, staring at the guard who'd already moved on to help the next woman down, his movements careful, almost anxious, as if he was afraid of them. Greta descended on shaking legs, expecting at any moment for the performance to crack, for the real treatment to begin. But the guards remained at a distance, herding them forward with voices, not hands. No one grabbed, no one leered. They moved through the camp gates like ghosts processing other ghosts, everyone too afraid to break whatever spell was keeping the violence at bay. Rheinzelen camp spread before them in orderly rows of barracks that looked almost surreal in their normalcy. Barbed wire, yes, coils of it marking the perimeter, reminding them they were prisoners. But the buildings had windows, real glass that caught the afternoon light. The paths between them were swept clean. A British flag hung limp in the still air, And beyond the fence line, Greta could see German countryside rolling green and indifferent to the war that had just torn the world apart. They were processed with mechanical efficiency that felt more unnerving than cruelty would have been. Names recorded in neat ledgers. Belongings cataloged, not stolen, not tossed aside, but written down on carbon copy forms with everything spelled correctly. Numbers assigned, promises made that these items would be returned. A female British nurse conducted medical inspections, speaking broken German with her eyes fixed on her clipboard, never meeting their gaze. She was young, maybe 25, and her hands trembled slightly when she checked pulses and temperatures. Greta realized with a shock, she's as uncomfortable as we are. The barracks were clean, not comfortable. Wooden bunks stacked too high, thin mattresses that had seen better days, a single stove in the corner for heat but clean, no filth, no overcrowding. 40 women to a barracks designed for 40. Greta claimed a lower bunk and sat on the edge, the mattress giving slightly beneath her weight. An actual mattress. Stuffed with straw, probably, but real. Liesel Hartmann, 19 years old and still carrying herself like the League of German Girls leader she'd been just months ago, took the bunk above Greta's. She leaned down, her face pale and rigid with conviction. "It's a trick," she whispered. "They're softening us up, making us trust them before they—" She didn't finish, didn't need to. Greta wanted to believe her. Believing Liesel meant the world still made sense, still operated on the rules they'd learned. But the doubt had already taken root, a cold seed of confusion spreading through her chest. That night, as the sun set through those impossible glass windows, a British sergeant arrived with a translator. His uniform was pressed, his boots polished, his face utterly unreadable. He stood at the front of the barracks and read from a document in a flat, official tone that the translator rendered into German with careful precision. The Geneva Convention, their rights as prisoners, the rules of conduct, the daily schedule. Then he said the words that split Greta's understanding of reality clean in half. "You will receive the same rations as British servicewomen. You will not be forced to work, but may volunteer. Male privileges will begin in 2 weeks. Any guard who touches you inappropriately will face court-martial." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of relief, the silence of free fall, of every certainty dissolving at once. Greta stared at the photograph in her hand, at Annalise's fading smile, and felt something worse than fear settle into her bones. Confusion. The most dangerous question of all. If the propaganda lied about this, what else was a lie? The routine began in early May, and with it came a kind of precision that felt almost obsessive. Morning formation happened at 700 hours exactly. Not 7:05, not 6:55, but 700 on the dot. The British Guards stood at least 6 feet away from the assembled prisoners, counting heads with their eyes, never bodies. They called out numbers in English, checked them against clipboards, and moved on. No one reached out to turn a face toward the light. No one grabbed an arm to pull someone into line. They simply counted, recorded, and departed. Greta watched them with the same analytical mind that had made her valuable to the Luftwaffe. She'd spent 3 years monitoring radio traffic, learning to spot patterns in static, to hear what wasn't being said in the gaps between transmissions. Now she applied those skills to her captors, studying their movements like coded messages. Corporal Thomas Evans supervised the morning counts, a Welshman in his 40s with kind eyes that never quite smiled. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture military straight, his voice steady as he ran through the daily announcements. He never raised his tone, never threatened, just repeated the rules in the same flat cadence every morning until they became a kind of lullaby. The food arrived on carts at precise intervals. Breakfast at 800 hours, lunch at 1300, dinner at 1800. Corporal Evans distributed the Red Cross parcels himself, setting them on a wooden table near the barracks entrance and then stepping back, creating space for the women to approach on their own terms. The parcels contained things that seemed impossible: tinned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, powdered milk. Luxuries that most German civilians hadn't seen in years, now handed to enemy prisoners as if they were owed. The daily rations matched what the sergeant had promised. Porridge in the mornings, thick and gray but filling. Bread that was slightly stale but real, made from actual wheat instead of sawdust and hope. Turnip soup at lunch that tasted like vegetables instead of hot water with regret. Greta forced herself to eat slowly, to make each bite last, but her body betrayed her with its hunger. 3 years of rationing had taught her stomach to accept anything. Now it remembered what satisfaction felt like. Hilda Vogel broke down, crying at dinner on the 4th day. She sat on her bunk with a piece of bread in her hands, tears streaming silently down her face as the other women pretended not to notice. Later, when the lights were dimmed and most had settled into restless sleep, she whispered to Greta in the darkness, "My children are eating grass soup, boiled weeds, and potato peels, and I'm here eating bread. Real bread." Her voice cracked. "What kind of mother am I?" Greta had no answer. She lay in her bunk, staring at the wooden slats above her head, and wondered if mercy could be a form of torture, if being treated well while your family starved was actually crueler than being beaten. Not everyone accepted the situation with quiet confusion. Liesl Hartmann had gathered a small circle of true believers, 5 women who refused to speak to the guards, refused to volunteer for work details, refused to accept what they called the deception. They sat together at meals, whispering theories about what the British were really planning. Fattening them up for medical experiments, maybe, or lulling them into trust before shipping them to labor camps in England. Liesl's certainty was magnetic for those who couldn't bear the alternative, that they'd been wrong about everything. The tension in the camp was subtle but constant, like a frequency only certain people could hear. Most of the women fell into a gray middle ground, neither trusting nor rebelling, simply existing in a state of suspended animation. They followed the rules because following rules felt safer than making choices. They ate the food because starving themselves proved nothing. They avoided the guards' eyes because eye contact required acknowledging them as human, and that acknowledgement felt like betrayal of something they couldn't quite name. Then came the incident with Inga Schmidt, a former school teacher who'd lost everything, husband to the Eastern Front, home to Allied bombs, faith to exhaustion. She'd been getting progressively more agitated, her movements jerky, her muttering audible during formation. On the 9th day, something inside her snapped. It happened during the morning distribution of parcels. Corporal Evans was setting out the boxes as usual, his movements practiced and efficient, when Ing suddenly lunged forward. She screamed at him in German, words about murderers and cowards and bombers who killed children. She spat at his boots, called him filth, dared him to hit her, practically begged him to prove that the monster she expected was hiding behind that careful mask of civility. Evans went very still. Every woman in the yard held her breath, waiting for the explosion, the retaliation, the confirmation that yes, this had all been pretense. But Evans just looked at Inga for a long moment, his face unreadable, then stepped back. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, wrote something down with a pencil stub, and walked away. His boots crunched on the gravel path, steady and unhurried, until he disappeared around the corner of the administration building. The women stared at each other, at Inga, who stood trembling in the center of the yard, at the parcels still sitting on the table untouched. An hour later, a different guard came to inform Inga she'd received an official warning for verbal abuse of personnel. The warning would go in her file. 3 warnings meant loss of privileges. That was all. No beating, no solitary confinement. A written warning on a carbon copy form that explained in bureaucratic German exactly what rules she'd broken and what the consequences were. Inga collapsed onto a bench and laughed until she sobbed. The sound was awful, broken glass wrapped in hysteria. Hilda sat beside her and held her hand, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. The propaganda had taught them what to expect from victorious men. It had prepared them for violence, for degradation, for the kind of cruelty that confirmed their worst fears about the enemy. It had never prepared them for restraint. That night, Greta volunteered for kitchen duty. Not because she believed in cooperation, not because she'd forgiven anything, but because sitting still with her thoughts was unbearable. She needed her hands busy. She needed to focus on something tangible, peeling potatoes, washing dishes, counting spoons, so her mind would stop circling the same impossible question. If they'd been wrong about this, about the basic nature of their enemy, what else had been lies? And if everything was lies, who had she been for the last 12 years? The male privileges began in late May, and with them came a tension that made the previous weeks feel almost peaceful. The announcement was posted on the barracks wall, handwritten in careful German, specifying that prisoners could send 3 letters per month and receive unlimited correspondence, subject to censorship for security purposes. The British provided paper, envelopes, and pencils. All the women had to do was write. Most stared at the blank pages for hours. What did you say to people you hadn't seen since the world ended? How did you explain where you were, what had happened, whether you were even the same person who'd left? Greta filled 3 sheets with cramped handwriting to a neighbor in Hamburg, asking about her mother, about Annalisa, about whether their streets still existed. She folded the letter with shaking hands and dropped it in the collection box, then spent the next 2 weeks in a state of suspended dread. The first responses arrived on a Tuesday morning. Corporal Evans brought them in a canvas bag, calling out names in his Welsh-accented German, handing each envelope over with the same careful distance he maintained in everything. Some women grabbed their letters and ran to corners to read in private. Others held them unopened, as if the paper itself might burn. Greta's letter came from Frau Weber, the neighbor who'd lived 3 doors down for 20 years and made the best apple strudel in the district. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places as if tears had fallen while writing. Greta's mother had died in the firestorm that consumed Hamburg in July of 1943. The building had collapsed, the shelter had flooded, and most of their street had burned alive in a single night of bombing that turned the air itself into flame. Annalise had been evacuated to the countryside before the attack, sent away with the other children, but Frau Weber hadn't heard from her since. No one had. The records were chaos, the cities were rubble, and thousands of children were simply gone into the smoke of a collapsing nation. The letter ended with a sentence that Greta read 3 times, unable to process. The Tommies gave us food when they arrived, more than our own soldiers did at the end. Greta sat on her bunk for an hour, the letter loose in her hands, her mind unable to reconcile the words with everything she'd believed. Her mother had died in British bombs. That was a fact, solid and terrible and true. But British soldiers had fed the survivors. That was also true. Both things existed at the same time, and holding them together felt like trying to grip smoke. Hilda received nothing. She'd sent 3 letters to 3 different addresses, her mother's house, her sister's apartment, the factory where she'd worked, and waited each mail call with a desperation that hurt to witness. When her name wasn't called, she'd nod once, very small, and walk back to her bunk with her spine straight and her face blank. But at night, Greta heard her crying into her thin pillow, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Liesel got a letter from her brother, an SS officer now in Allied custody somewhere in Bavaria. His words were bitter and unrepentant, full of warnings about trusting the enemy's false kindness, reminders that the struggle wasn't over, predictions that Germany would rise again from this temporary defeat. He wrote like a man reciting doctrine because doctrine was all he had left. But his handwriting shook. The letters slanted and cramped together as if his hand had trembled holding the pen. Even through the bravado, Greta could read the fear bleeding through the ink. He was terrified, just like all of them, and covering it with the only armor he knew. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon during recreation hour. The British had designated 2 hours each day for what they called free time. Prisoners could walk the yard, sit in the sun, write letters, or simply exist without structure. Most women used it to pace or stare at the sky, or sit in small clusters and not talk about the things they couldn't stop thinking about. Greta was sitting on a bench near the barracks, the photograph of Annalise balanced on her knee, when Corporal Evans approached. She tensed instinctively, but he stopped a respectful distance away, his hands at his sides, holding a small wooden box. "Miss Meyer," he said in his careful German, "one of the lads found this in the ruins near where you were captured. Medical papers inside had your name. Thought you'd want it." He set the box on the bench beside her and stepped back immediately, creating space. Greta stared at it, then at him, then back at the box. Her hands moved without her permission, lifting the lid with fingertips that barely felt connected to her body. Inside was Annalise's confirmation certificate, the paper yellowed but intact. A pressed flower, long dead, its petals brown and brittle. A blue ribbon from some school achievement Greta had forgotten. Small things, meaningless things. Everything that mattered. Her voice came out broken, barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Evans looked at the ground, at his boots, at something past her shoulder, anywhere but at her face. "Because rules matter, even after everything." He paused, then added quietly, "Especially after everything." Then he walked away before she could respond, his footsteps measured and even, leaving her alone with a box of her sister's childhood and a question she couldn't answer. That night, Greta lay awake long after lights out, the box tucked under her pillow where she could feel its solid weight. She thought about her father, a Wehrmacht officer who died at Stalingrad before the end came. He'd told her once, over dinner in a world that no longer existed, that the British were honorless, that they preached civilization while practicing barbarism, that German discipline and German order were superior to the hypocritical morality of the West. He'd believed it absolutely, and she'd believed him because fathers were supposed to know truth. What if he'd been wrong about everything? What if the superiority he'd taught her to prize was just another kind of lie? What if strength didn't mean domination and victory didn't mean crushing the enemy, and discipline was just cruelty with better posture? The question spiraled through her mind like radio static, signals she couldn't decode, transmissions from a frequency she'd never learned to hear. Around her, other women breathed in sleep, or pretended to, each one alone with her own reckoning. The camp was silent except for the wind in the wire and the occasional footsteps of guards making their rounds, steady and unhurried, following rules that somehow mattered more than revenge. The projection truck arrived on a Wednesday in mid-June, rumbling through the camp gates with a canvas-covered trailer that the guards set up in the largest clearing between barracks. They erected a screen, just a white sheet stretched between two posts, and arranged benches in rough rows facing it. The announcement came during morning formation. All prisoners were required to attend a presentation at 1400 hours. Attendance was mandatory. The words "re-education program" appeared on the notice board, translated into precise German that somehow made the whole thing sound both official and ominous. The women filed into the makeshift theater in silence, their faces already closed, already preparing for whatever propaganda the British wanted to feed them. Greta sat between Hilda and a woman named Clara who'd barely spoken since arrival. Liesel and her circle of believers sat in the back row, arms crossed, expressions defiant. A British officer stood near the projector, his face tight with something that looked like controlled fury barely held in check. The lights dimmed. The projector clattered to life. And then the images began. The first shots were aerial views, bombed landscapes, ruined cities, the kind of destruction everyone had seen already. But then the camera moved closer. Barbed wire, guard towers, signs in German, Arbeit macht frei, work sets, you free. The camera panned across faces, and those faces weren't faces anymore. They were skulls wrapped in skin, eyes too large for their sockets, bodies that looked like X-rays of bodies, like something animated by will alone because flesh had given up. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The names appeared on title cards between shots. Mountains of corpses stacked like cordwood, casual as firewood, arms and legs jutting at impossible angles. British soldiers wearing masks walked through the carnage, their movements careful, their horror visible even through the grainy footage. Survivors stumbled through the frame, skeletal and swaying, barely human enough to register as alive. A woman next to Greta made a choking sound and ran for the exit. One of the guards let her pass without stopping her. On screen, bulldozers pushed bodies into mass graves, while officers in pristine uniforms stood watching, taking notes on clipboards as if documenting a livestock count. Then came the gas chambers, the ovens, The medical experiment rooms with their tidy instruments and meticulous records. A wall of children's shoes piled higher than a man's head. Suitcases with names written in chalk. All the belongings of people who'd been promised resettlement and received only death. Liesel shouted from the back row, her voice cracking with desperation. Lies! Propaganda! British lies! But her voice sounded small against the silence of everyone else, and even she seemed to hear how hollow it rang, how much it sounded like begging. Other women covered their faces. Some vomited into their hands or onto the ground. Hilda wept silently, tears streaming down her face without sound, her body shaking so hard that Greta could feel it through the bench they shared. Greta sat frozen, her mind trying to process what her eyes were showing her and failing. Failing completely, because she'd known. Not the details, not the scale, but she'd known something. The trains that passed through her signal station heading east, the ones she'd been ordered not to log, not to mention, not to think about. Freight cars packed with people visible through the slats if you let yourself look, which she hadn't. She'd kept her eyes on her equipment, her logs, her duty. She'd told herself it wasn't her responsibility, wasn't her business, wasn't something she could change even if she wanted to. The projector clicked off. The sudden silence felt like a physical weight. The British officer stepped forward, his voice tight and controlled, every word enunciated with the precision of a man who didn't trust himself to speak naturally. "This is what you fought for," he said. "What you enabled. Some of you knew, some of you didn't, but all of you will reckon with it now." The words landed like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were true, because there was no defense, no argument, no way to unsee what had been seen. The propaganda had told them stories about Jewish conspiracies and racial threats and the necessity of extreme measures for national survival. But those stories had been abstractions, theories, ideas that let you look away from freight trains and not ask questions. This was concrete. This was bodies. This was the actual outcome of every time someone had chosen not to know. The women filed out of the theater in complete silence. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. They dispersed to their barracks like ghosts, each one alone with the images burned into her retinas and the questions burning holes in her conscience. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk listening to the sounds of women crying in the darkness and thought about her father again, about the Wehrmacht officer who told her that German civilization was superior, that German order would save Europe from chaos, that sometimes harsh measures were necessary for the greater good. He'd believed it. She'd believed him. And 6 million people had died in the machinery of that belief. At some point past midnight, she heard movement near the latrines, quick footsteps, then a thud, then shouting. Guards running. She sat up, heart pounding, and saw Hilda's bunk empty, blankets tangled. Other women were rising, moving toward the commotion. By the time Greta reached the latrine building, British guards were already cutting Hilda down from the ceiling beam where she tried to hang herself with torn bedsheets. They performed first aid with the same mechanical efficiency they applied to everything else. Checked her pulse, cleared her airway, wrapped blankets around her shaking body. One guard ran for the medical officer while another stayed with Hilda, kneeling beside her, speaking in low tones that Greta couldn't hear but could feel, steady, calm. The voice of someone talking a person back from an edge. No one punished Hilda. They transferred her to the medical ward and assigned her a suicide watch, a guard who sat outside her door, not as a jailer but as a witness, someone to ensure she wasn't alone. The chaplain came the next day, an Anglican priest who spoke fluent German and sat with her for hours, saying nothing, just present. Greta stood outside the medical building and watched the chaplain arrive with his worn Bible and his kind, tired face. She thought about mercy again, about how the British could have let Hilda die and called it justice, could have treated her attempt as another rule violation, another mark against a defeated enemy. Instead, they saved her, sat with her, bore witness to her breaking, and somehow that mercy felt crueler than any beating, because punishment you could survive. Punishment confirmed that you were still the enemy, still the other, still separate. But mercy required you to be human, required you to face what you'd done, what you'd allowed, what you'd been. And facing that was the hardest thing of all. The days after the screening moved slowly, each hour heavy with a silence that felt different from before. Hilda recovered physically within a week, her throat bruised but healing, her body responding to the medical care with the stubborn resilience of someone who'd survived too much to quit easily. But her spirit remained fractured. She barely spoke, barely ate, barely seemed present even when her eyes were open. The chaplain, Captain Richard Whitmore, visited her twice daily, never pushing, never preaching, just sitting in the chair beside her bed with his hands folded and his presence steady as a heartbeat. The camp felt darker now, though nothing visible had changed. The same routines continued: morning formation, meals at precise intervals, work details for those who volunteered. But something fundamental had shifted. The women moved through their days like people underwater, every action requiring extra effort, every breath deliberate. The screening had cracked something open, and now they were all living in the aftermath, trying to figure out how to exist with the knowledge they couldn't unlearn. Greta volunteered for the vegetable garden detail in late June, partly because her hands needed work and partly because the garden was on the far edge of camp, away from the barracks and the constant weight of other people's grief. The detail was supervised by Private David Davies, a 20-year-old farm boy from Sussex who treated the garden with more tenderness than he showed to people. He'd coaxed tomato plants from bombed soil, nursed bean vines up makeshift trellises, convinced lettuce to grow despite the late planting and poor drainage. They worked in silence most days, Davies demonstrating techniques with his hands rather than words, Greta following his lead and learning the language of growing things. One afternoon, as they worked side by side pinching suckers from the tomato plants, Davies spoke quietly without looking at her. "Me mom taught me this. She grows the best tomatoes in the village. Says you've got to be firm but gentle, or you'll damage the main stem." Greta nodded, focusing on the delicate work, the sharp green smell of tomato leaves on her fingers. Davies continued in his soft Sussex accent. "She'd like you. Mom would. Says anyone who can grow food is worth knowing regardless of where they're from." The words hung in the humid air between them. Greta realized with a start that he was trying to tell her something, that he saw her as a person, not just a prisoner, not just an enemy, that his mother, safe in England growing tomatoes, would see her the same way. It was such a small offering, so simple it almost seemed meaningless. But it cracked something in Greta's chest, a tiny fissure in the armor she'd been wearing since capture. "Your mother sounds wise," she said finally, her German-accented English halting but clear. Davies smiled just a little, and they went back to work. Corporal Evans called a meeting in early July, gathering the women in the mess hall after dinner. He stood at the front of the room with his usual rigid posture, his face carefully neutral, and explained that the camp administration was starting what he called a reconciliation circle. Voluntary attendance, twice weekly, where German prisoners could ask questions and British personnel would answer honestly. No punishment for anything said, no record kept of who attended or what they asked. The first session drew maybe 20 women, curiosity overcoming caution. Greta went because staying in the barracks felt worse than facing whatever this was. They sat in a rough circle on folding chairs, British soldiers and German prisoners, everyone looking uncomfortable and nobody quite sure where to put their hands. Inga Schmidt spoke first, her voice sharp with challenge. "Why don't you hate us? You should. We would if the positions were reversed." Evans was quiet for a long time, his weathered face thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was discovering them as he said them. "Some of us do. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But if we act on that hate, if we become the kind of men who abuse prisoners, then we become what we fought against. The rules, the convention, they're not for you. They're for us. So we stay human." Liesel leaned forward, her young face twisted with anger and pain. "Your bombs killed my mother in Dresden, burned her. Alive. You talk about humanity, but you dropped fire from the sky." Evans met her eyes directly, and for the first time Greta saw real emotion crack through his careful composure. Grief, raw and honest. I'm sorry. Truly, war makes monsters of all sides. What happened in Dresden was terrible. What happened in Hamburg, in Cologne, in all the cities we burned? I can't defend it, but it's over now. What we do next, how we treat each other in this moment, that's the only thing we can control. The silence that followed felt different from the heavy silences before, less like weight and more like space opening up for something new to grow. Greta found her voice, the question that had haunted her since the first day. What happens when we're released? Where do we go? Evan's face softened, barely perceptible, but Greta had learned to read him. You go home. You rebuild. You tell the truth about what happened, both what was done to you and what you allowed. That's the hardest work there is, but it's the only way forward. The sessions continued through July, attendance growing each week. Not everyone came. Liesel's circle had shrunk to 3 diehards who refused to participate in what they still called collaboration. But most women attended at least once, drawn by the desperate need to understand how the world had become something so different from what they'd been taught. Small changes began rippling through the camp like circles spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Hilda started teaching other women how to mend clothes, her skilled hands finding purpose in repair even when her voice remained mostly silent. Davies brought Greta a letter from the Red Cross. Annalise was alive, living with an aunt in Schleswig-Holstein, safe and looking for her older sister. Greta held that letter like a prayer, like permission to hope for something beyond survival. Captain Whitmore began helping women write letters of apology to people they'd wronged. Not letters to send, necessarily, but letters that needed to be written. Former neighbors who'd been denounced. Jewish colleagues who'd been fired and forgotten. Children who'd been taught to hate in Hitler youth meetings. The women wrote with shaking hands, crying onto the paper, trying to find words for complicity that had no adequate language. Even Liesel softened, though she'd never admit it. During one of the reconciliation circles, she had a panic attack after another re-education screening, hyperventilating and shaking so badly she couldn't stand. A guard, the same one she'd been spitting at for weeks, knelt beside her and talked her through it with steady calm, teaching her to count breaths until the terror passed. She didn't thank him, but she stopped spitting.